Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, the Syrian civil war, which is the topic for this program, was never really over, but it had quietened down in an uneasy peace after the Idlib ceasefire deal between Turkey and Russia and multiple rounds of Astana format involving Russia, Turkey, and Iran, and aimed at ending the armed conflict in Syria and basically trying to jumpstart a formal political negotiating process. That situation, at least in the Northwest, has changed with an offensive launched and led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS for short, against Aleppo, which is the second largest city in Syria in the Northwest. And this city, up until recently, was held by the Syrian army loyal to President Bashar al-Assad, with support from allies in Iran, Russia, and the Lebanese Hezbollah. Latest reports suggest the HTS fighters have taken over Aleppo and might be advancing south into territory controlled by Assad's forces. The renewed fighting in Aleppo marks a new phase in Syria's long-running civil war, which began in 2011 during the Arab Spring protests. Russia has responded to the rebel offensive with airstrikes, but has also asked for an immediate convening of Astana format to discuss the situation in Syria. And this is a demand that has also been made by the Iranian foreign minister. Now, Russia never had a truly sizable contingent in Syria, roughly about 5,000 troops, but its air power helped Assad's forces tremendously in defeating various groups and securing territory. And let me say that when we talk about groups in Syria, more than in any other civil war, frankly, it's an alphabet soup of, this number of groups, the big ones, the small ones, with different ideologies, different motives and motivations for overthrowing Assad's regime. Some of them have merged together, so they've become bigger franchises. But the timing of the HTS offensive raises a number of questions, which I shall discuss with my panel of experts. I have with me Caroline Rose. She is the director of the Strategic Blind Spots portfolio at the New Lines Institute, where she leads and produces research on the intersection of defense, security, illicit trades, and geopolitical landscape from Europe to the Middle East and North Africa. I am also joined by Leila Hatoum from South Lebanon, where she is right now, a longtime war correspondent, international law expert, political economist, and chief editor of MENA Uncensored. Thank you to both of you. Now, let me begin with Caroline, if I may. So, Caroline, I find this very interesting, the timing of this offensive. That's one point. Secondly, anyone who understands military operational art knows that while this has come suddenly, this kind of offensive would require a lot of preparation in terms of, rations for the fighters, ammunitions, weapons, the whole logistics, the whole idea of sustaining this operation. Because obviously, if you're going for this kind of offensive, you will be expecting a reaction, a response from the adversary, in this case, Assad's forces. So what I find interesting, and this is where I kind of circle back to the idea of the timing. Normally, Western intelligence agencies, specifically the US intelligence agencies, are very quick about something which is coming. But in this particular case, there's been complete quiet. So I'm assuming that is significant. I'd like to discuss this with Leila also, because Leila's correspondents are reporting from the ground. What do you make of this?
Certainly, and thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be here and to talk about really what's happening in Syria, because ultimately, In the last few days, it's been less than a week, and we've seen the entire geopolitical security landscape of Syria unravel. The opposition forces have been able to consolidate over 20% more of territory in Syria. Just a few days ago, the Syrian regime had control and had dominance over roughly 70% of territory in Syria. And now, just of last night, it's looking a bit more like 50-50. And that is just really unfathomable when you think about the pace, the scale of these operations. Now, regarding the timing, this was something that was underway by HTS and opposition groups well before this week. Expected about 5 to 6 weeks in terms of preparation and planning. They were trying to ascertain what was the proper time, given the fact that there was also a ceasefire agreement that was being made between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And in order to appear that they were not aligning with Israel directly and that this was a byproduct of that ceasefire, they launched this offensive on the day of the ceasefire, with the goal of trying to consolidate and regain territory around a very strategic highway called the M5 highway. Back in 2019 and 2020, there were a series of clashes between opposition forces and the regime that really, sparked this concern that conflict would once again spill over. And because of that, we saw a series of very tentative ceasefire agreements forged between Turkish, Russian, Syrian regime and opposition forces that really did try and divide this territory north and south of the M5 highway. Now, in my own analysis, I think that these opposition forces gained a lot of momentum. They had the strategic and tactical advancement and benefit of having drone squadrons with them this time. They also, of course, I think had a lot of preparation and training with their own personnel. And because of that, they were able to push far beyond the M5 highway. And in fact, consolidate the M5 highway, which connects Damascus to Aleppo, which is the second largest city in Syria, and use that to cut the logistical and supply lines for regime forces. Then from there, they pushed to Aleppo city, which is just incredibly impressive. And then yesterday, they started to push towards Hama. There's also a popular belief that they potentially could have the capacity to push to Homs as well. And as we're seeing today and this morning, they're pushing further north into Tel Rifat, which is SDF controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this is where things get incredibly messy when we start to move.
I'm happy that you talked about this Tal Rifat thing, because Turkey is coming into the fray. They're actually deploying some troops there. But here's the thing, Caroline. You talked about how much preparation they did, and this is something which can be picked up through satellites, through chatter, through human, through a number of sources. But from on the day that this happened, a number of, and I've been watching multiple channels and social media reports and the rest of it, and a number of experts have talked about, oh, this has come suddenly. So my point is that why was there absolutely, there's not a squeak from the Western intelligence agencies about this preparation that was going on. And then the offensive coming on the day of the ceasefire. And the fact that Netanyahu, a day before the ceasefire, made it very clear that now with the ceasefire in Lebanon, Israel is going to focus on Iran. So if you look at these as the little pieces of a mosaic, it seems to be, and I don't want to get into a conspiratorial mode, but I'm just saying that these are too many coincidences.
Certainly. Well, yesterday there was a statement that was released from the National Security Council from the White House, led by Brett McGurk, who's been to this point the czar of Middle East policy, and ultimately acknowledging that things were moving fast in Syria. They were monitoring closely, And it was interesting. They blamed the conditions as to why things changed on the ground in Syria. To one, the regime's refusal to comply and change its behavior in accordance to UN Resolution 2254. And of course, really engage in a political process in Syria, change its behavior in respect to human rights, and of course, some of the geopolitical demands had been made. And then secondly, they also blamed the Syrian regime's reliance on Iran and Iran-backed groups in Syria as a reason why we were seeing things change so quickly, which was interesting because it's partly the reason why the regime was incapacitated. It was the fact that Iran-aligned militias, leadership, the fact that they have been hit so heavily by Israeli strikes, the parallel conflict that had been opened in Lebanon, this certainly did impact the operational capacity of the regime and its partners. But I think that there are a few other conditions and elements that are at play here that the statement didn't necessarily acknowledge. And the statement also said that the United States, its intelligence agencies, had nothing to do with this offensive. I think that really the United States was indeed caught off guard by just the pace and the scope of these operations. I think that we all expected that Israel would indeed turn it and shift its attention to conduct strikes in Syria, particularly along the Mediterranean coast, in Latakia, in Damascus, potentially in Homs, as well as in the south, in potentially Dara and Sueda. But we did not expect that, and I think the United States did not expect that there would be a opposition offensive that would essentially open up and fold Syria from the inside out. I do think, though, up to the point of Aleppo, it does serve U.S. interests. They have not been in favor of regime control of Aleppo, of the Northwest. I think also for the United States, they are looking to continue to pressure and consolidate gains from the regime and Iran-backed groups. But now I think, and we're seeing this today, as this starts to move to the northeast, into Tel Rifat, into SDF-controlled areas, coincidentally where the United States has 900 active duty personnel stationed. This is where I think the U.S. Things being in favor of U.S. interests starts to run out. I think now the United States is going to be watching with grave concern as to how SDF and opposition forces, particularly the HDS, engage with each other. Now there's a potential chance for an opened Turkish ground or air offensive in northeast Syria. And this is where I think things will get incredibly chaotic, and potentially the regime could recover some lost territory and start to build momentum, especially if Russia starts to change its calculus and back the Syrian regime much more than, for example, what we've seen in the last 2-3 days.
Right. That's a very important point with reference to the SDF. I don't know. I mean, the Russians are, of course, bombing Aleppo and the HDS positions, but they have already pulled out the more veteran troops, and they're basically there are not too many of them. They also pulled out a squadron of Su-35s and a battery of S-300s. And you got some of the replacements are basically rookies. So I'm not, and as you know, they have not been providing, or they've cut down massively on the financial support also and other aid also. So did Iran, by the way. But I think it's a good point to pull Leila into this. But I want to both for to position this discussion and also for our viewers, it's important to perhaps mention what HTS is. Now, HTS is a new name. I mean, it started as Jabhat al-Nusra, which was a direct affiliate of Al-Qaeda. And as a matter of fact, the leader of the self-styled Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was also involved in its formation. This was a time when Al-Qaeda and IS were kind of operating together of sorts in before they separated and started fighting each other. It was also regarded at that time as one of the most effective and deadly of the groups ranged against Assad. But in 2016, the group's leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, and some call him Golani. I don't know if it's the Egyptian version of turning the Arabic Jim into Gaf or what it is, but he broke ranks with Al-Qaeda. He dissolved Jabhat al-Nusra and set up this new organization with this new name, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So, Leila, it's interesting that when I read the Western press in the last 3-4 days, and also watch these programs, analyses on TV channels, it's interesting that no one is referring to HTS as a terrorist group. They're being referred to as rebels fighting against Assad's regime, which obviously is qualified as very brutal. You've been watching this, and I saw you had these Twitter Spaces also, or are they now called X Spaces? I don't know. I mean, there's a total confusion about what it's called now. And you've got correspondents on the ground. Give us a sense of what do you think is going on?
Well, it's very interesting because it's usually the pro-Muslim Brotherhood and international media that are under the Americans, the French, and the British, who are focusing on using the word rebels instead of terrorists. At the end of the day, the United States fought Al-Qaeda. So as far as I'm concerned, the US media should be calling them terrorists. As you said, HTC, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is made, basically, it started with Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the arm of Al-Qaeda in the Levant, rebranding itself to, Jabhat Fath al-Sham. They called themselves the Sham Conquest Front, Jabhat Fath al-Sham. And that was in 2016. Shy of a year later, in 2017, they declared that they had dissolved themselves and they had joined 4 other groups: Nur al-Din Zinki, Ansar al-Din, Liwa al-Haq, and Jaish al-Sunnah. And they are all not radical, but terrorist groups and offshoots of ISIS as well, one of them. So they merged all together into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTC as you call it, right? Hayat Tahrir al-Sham means the Committee to Liberate Sham. And they were headed by Abu Jaber Hashim, but the person who was taking making the calls was Abu Muhammad al-Julani. And Abu Muhammad al-Julani, nobody knows his background, nobody knows his real name. It's every single time you have a new name for him. So that makes me wonder who actually sent him to that area. But that's another story. They only made a move less than 12 hours after Benjamin Netanyahu went out on TV, after his miniature cabinet signed or agreed to a ceasefire understanding with Lebanon. He came out and he said, we're going to focus on Syria and cut off the supply lines to the resistance in Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we're going to focus on banning Iran from arming and basically increasing its power in the region. Shortly afterwards, we see this massive attack happening, going from the Turkish borders, the Syrian-Turkish borders, all the way down southwards. So we're talking about from northern Syria southwards to Aleppo, to Hama. Of course, they took over Sarakib, but that mass-scale attack, as Ms. Rose said, it was impactful because nobody expected it. But at the same time, from a military perspective, because I was speaking to some generals on the ground to try to understand what's the situation, and what I understood is basically that they were monitoring certain movements along the borders. They allowed them in, and you notice what the Russians did. The Russians hit the back side of those terrorists who came in, and then they hit the middle, the central. So they cut them into 3 parts. You had the media, the international media, and the Arab media supporting Muslim Brotherhood, and the Arab media that are anti-Assad. If you look at Al Jazeera and others, I'm not going to name everybody, but I understand the situation. They started saying the rebels have entered Hama. They did not enter Hama. We had videos from reporters on the ground showing us that there's nobody in Hama. They claimed that they took over Aleppo. From the very first day, they only reached Rif Halab. Rif Aleppo, which is basically the suburbs of Aleppo, not the city, the major city itself. I'm talking about the time when they announced it. So they were actually causing this frustration in the media to create this devastation among the people who are living there so they can create a mass movement out. The reason why it's happening is because the Israelis had not closed, but covered up one front, and they're opening another one. At the end of the day, they're looking at dismantling Syria and taking over for their Greater Israel project. They're looking at expanding their borders towards Lebanon as well, but they cannot fight two fronts at the same time. You need to weaken Syria, which had recently managed to control the situation and was starting to take over basically all of its territories and basically send its troops everywhere. The only thing that actually makes me draw a question mark is the attack that happened against Konoko, the American base in Konoko, that's in eastern Syria, 3 days before this attack happened. And it was by the groups that support the government. So we're talking about the tribes. So the Syrians were giving a hard time for the American occupation of Syria and northern Syria and eastern Syria. And then you have the ceasefire that happened in Lebanon. Then you had basically the Turks and the pro-Israeli troops, I'm going to call them the terrorists, basically attacking the Syrian army and the Syrian towns.
Right. So this is something that I will take to Caroline also. But Leila, we know one thing very clearly, and that is also borne out by a number of Israeli airstrikes in the past years in Syria, especially against the Hezbollah and the Iranian targets. The Israelis, and there have been lots of analyses within the Israeli media about the strategic importance of Syria for Israel's security from the perspective of Iran actually using the territory to supply and resupply Hezbollah with a number of weapon systems and platforms, and also placing missiles on Syrian soil. It's almost like, if you go back in a way, it's akin to the Soviets back in the 60s, putting missiles on Cuban soil, which started the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you think that there is enough reason to believe that this particular offensive is being directly or indirectly supported by the Israelis or allies linked to Israel?
Well, think about it this way. Gadi Eisenkot, the former chief of staff of the Israeli militias, I'm going to call them, they're not defensive forces, they're occupation forces. He had confessed back in 2019 that they were supporting and supplying weapons to certain groups, they call them rebel groups as well, in Syria to defend themselves. He, on the record, said that in an interview with one of the British media, and it was carried out also by the Israeli media, so it's a matter of public record. And at the same time, we have information as reporters since 2013, the Israelis were sending weapons to these terrorist groups, especially ISIS and later on Nusra Front, the ones that were found between Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria. Remember that small triangle next to the Golan Heights, where they were stationed over there to protect the Israelis, and they were getting their medical treatment in Israel, in the Israeli entity. So the Israelis had not only given these factions and these groups throughout the past decade weapons, but also medical aid and support. And the media that supports the Israeli entity was basically fluffing them and whitewashing their picture across basically their media outlets. So I do believe, and this is not only based on belief, so there's reasonable doubt, we're going to use it as reasonable doubt, that the Israelis continue to arm and supply weapons to these entities. The timing from when Netanyahu said that they're going to focus on Syria and cut off the supply lines, and the attack that happened also adds to these suspicions. And the Israelis coming out recently, a few hours ago, you had Gideon Sa'ar, the foreign affairs minister of the Israeli entity, saying that both sides are bad, but that they support indirectly. In so few words, he said that they support the rebels against the Assad regime, despite the fact that both are bad. This is what he said, both sides are bad. So the Israelis are supporting them. The Israelis are not doing anything at all to show good intentions towards not having that front being ignited. They used their warplanes to go and bombard also the Syrian army in Syria recently. For me, at the end of the day, this is a massive war that's happening, mass-scale war between nations, and we have to just sit and watch because we cannot do anything as individuals. All we can do is basically together look at the timing, look at who helped in the past, look whose media is whitewashing their image, and then basically you get to see the bigger picture there.
Okay. So, Caroline, I want you to quickly say something about Leila's analysis of the situation. But then I also want you to take the discussion to let's identify the state actors here. There's Turkey, there's Russia, there's Iran, there's the United States, there's Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and of course we've already talked about Israel, as Leila has done. So let's try and sort of try and connect these dots, if you will, to see what kind of picture is emerging out of this.
So I'll start with, when it comes to looking at the timing, I agree in the sense that there's a lot there when it comes to the coincidence of this offensive being launched just a mere hours after the ceasefire was announced in Lebanon. But when we look at just the scale of the operation and now where it's headed, and as I mentioned before, I called it a mess because it really will be a mess when we start to see HGS forces engaging directly against SDF forces, this potential Turkish offensive in the Northeast. That does not build goodwill with the United States, given the fact that they have a very small contingent of forces there. They're looking to continue stability. There's also, of course, the issue of detention centers for ISIS fighters that have been really hanging on by a thread over these last few years, given the fact that detention security has been extremely weak. And we have seen low-level signs of low-level resurgence from ISIS fighters and other terrorist organizations that are operating in Northeast Syria. All that to say, I think that when we look at what states are backing this offensive, I think there are more signs that Turkey is putting its political weight and has put, to a degree, its operational and strategic calculus behind this offensive in the Northwest and potentially into Northeast Syria. Today, for example, there are already signs that they are seeking to launch strikes on Tel Rifat. They're also potentially trying to look further into the Northeast and establish what they call this peace corridor. They're also seeking to really loosen that partnership between the United States and the SDF. And so because of that, I'm curious, if this was an offensive that was supported by Israel, why then are we starting to see this trickling into the Northeast, which would lose support as well as really buy-in from the United States, and that is something Israel can't afford to lose.
Can I do a two-finger intervention here? And again, that is supported by evidence. Israel and the United States are allies, obviously, but the Israeli strategic calculus and their operational priorities are not always in sync with that of the United States. And since you look at this area, and we're doing this for a number of years now, you might recall Israeli analyses that essentially tried to tell the United States that do not completely decimate ISIS, because the Israeli calculus was that Iraq, Syria, Libya, they must remain internally unstable. And in order to get to that, there should be constant infighting. And by the way, this is not a new strategy. I mean, if you go back to the 30 Years' War, Cardinal Richelieu was a Catholic prince of the church, linked up with the Swedish Protestant king to ensure that the Germanic tribes constantly, keep warring, because that's going to keep France safe. So I think it's something where in terms of the smaller moving parts, if you will, there might be a disjuncture between the overall U.S. interests and that of the Israeli immediate interests.
Potentially, and I think we've seen that in Gaza, for example. The United States and Israel are not necessarily on the same page when it comes to their vision for the region and of course, how to achieve that. But I think, if this was an Israeli campaign to try, and ultimately their goal is to try and weaken Iran, of course, also the regime, it comes as a package deal with that sort of objective. But if this is about weakening Iran, we are starting to see the trickling in of Iran-aligned militias in from Iraq. For example, there was a call with Assad and Sudani last evening. We're also starting to see some flow of militants through the Al-Qaim highway into the northeast. It makes sense that there would be this juncture in northeast Syria, for example, near Deir ez-Zor. But I'm not necessarily sure if that would if trying to draw this into the northeast would be any sort of strategic long-term gain for Israel. Really, I'm seeing the main victor is Turkey here. Because otherwise, really what we would have seen was a concentration of fighting along the Mediterranean coast, where the regime has its large-scale, manufacturing and logistical centers, for example, in Latakia and Homs, Tartus. I think that we would have seen much more activity around there. And instead, what we're starting to see is this drawing of fighters and drawing of the conflict into the northeast instead of further into the northwest and along the Mediterranean coast. We did see some reported activity of, for example, an attempted coup d'etat. There were also substantiated reports about infighting between Assad's 4th Armored Division and the old Republican Guard. That was notable, but of course, we haven't necessarily seen evidence of that just yet.
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think those reports have really been corroborated by but of course.
I comment on that because we had a lengthy talks and phone calls yesterday with our contacts in Damascus and in Aleppo and in Hama as well. And there was no coup d'etat at all, or no fighting between the divisions of the Syrian military. And remember, we know enough generals from across, so basically it's anything that happens, you will hear it. The noise will reach us. But those were amplified in the media that basically are anti-Assad for a reason, to create that devastation and frustration within the troops themselves so they can leave. And then we heard about them entering Hama, and we had double-checked, and we saw videos that were sent by our reporters on the ground. Nothing happened in Hama. They claim that they took over again Aleppo, and this is not true. So if you remember when there was this coup that was happening in Turkey, and what you call the noise and propaganda started coming up in the GCC media that was anti-Turkey at the time, anti-Erdogan, a few years back, and nothing of the sort of what they had claimed happened. They claimed that they had taken over, nothing happened. Basically, it was a foiled attempt when others were basically claiming that they had victory in their media. So it's the same case scenario over here. When you have an attack and you want people to run away from your face so you can take over easily, and you want to devastate the troops, you start launching this propaganda and amplifying it in the media. It happened before. When it comes to Turkey, yesterday and today, we had Sergei Lavrov speaking with both his counterparts from Turkey and from Iran, trying to handle the situation. Remember, at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily have to be friends who are fighting together against Assad. The Israelis have an interest to move the front. The people who actually took advantage of this chaos were the Turks and the Muslim Brotherhood, and they went in. The first fight happened with Hayat Tahrir Sham, which is HTC, and that's Al-Qaeda. Those were formerly supported and funded by what you call GCC nations, including Saudi Arabia. We're talking about individuals, not necessarily states. And then when you have Muslim Brotherhood, that's fully funded and supported not only by Qatar, but also Turkey. So when you look at the situation, the ones that are supported by Turkey and Qatar, which are the Muslim Brotherhood and their factions, took advantage of this attack that the HTC made, and they actually made a big move. That's why you had two different fronts fighting and playing together.
Leila, I want to go back to Caroline, but quickly, one of the points which is very important, which Caroline is making, and which kind of complicates this equation, is the SDF. So if SDF tries to link up through the opposition territory with the smaller SDF presence in the northwest near Tal Rifat, then Turkey is going to come into the picture completely. We know that Turkey and the United States have been completely at loggerheads when it comes to perhaps not so much the PKK, but certainly YPG. And you know and for the United States, because these groups were fighting ISIS, they were very important. For Turkey, it seems to me, and I won't get Caroline's view on this, but the fact is that Turkey is playing its own very nationalist and kind of expansionist game in this entire thing, and it's not a new development at all. I mean, this has been going on for a very long time. Leila, first you, and then I want to get Caroline's view on this.
I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, at the end of the day, Turkey has not only nationalistic interests, but they also have greed when it comes to the northern parts of Syria. Remember, they took Iskenderun long time ago and they added it to themselves. During the beginning of the war on Syria, I'm not going to call it a revolution, the Turks were the first to go in with their army and take over. Like, you remember that tomb of one of their conquestors who was basically buried in Syria? They went over there claiming that they have national interests over there, and they had stationed their troops. They also have an issue with the Kurds in Syria, and they have to create that security buffer zone, much like the Israelis are trying to create buffer zones and take over land under the guise of basically creating buffer zones for their own security. This is what the Turks are doing. What they need is basically take over land, scorch land, and then kick out the Kurds, eliminate them, and add over more land to themselves. This is what
it does complicate the situation, because if the HTS gets into a fight with the SDF, then there is a problem, because then Caroline is right, because that kind of even if the Israelis want something out of this, it's going to become complicated for the United States. But Caroline, give us a sense of what Turkey is doing. I mean, we've discussed some of it, but I think we know that even before this entire thing exploded in 2011, the fact that despite such initial closeness between Erdogan and his family and Assad's family, and they're vacationing together and all of that, Erdogan kind of, he got after this case, and he was constantly telling Assad to almost to the extent of saying abdicate, right? And so Turkey has, from the get-go, has wanted to get rid of Assad. It's very clear. And it was only recently, last year, that, Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the rest of them, they kind of decided that, okay, here's the status quo on the ground, and it's kind of frozen. But it has kept simmering, as we can see now.
Certainly, I think that ultimately for Turkey, particularly also for its regional counterparts that have been seeking out normalization, the normalization process ebbs and flows. And each time we've seen normalization pop back up on the agendas of many countries in the Middle East and with Syria. The Syrian regime, despite economic devastation, despite international sanctions, despite a very frozen and static situation inside of Syria, continues to refuse and not budge when it comes to the demands that are put on the table in respect to progressing towards a political resolution under UN Resolution 2254, or, for example, the topic of repatriation of displaced populations, elements like that. And because of that, I think that's why we've seen Turkish frustration with Assad directly over the fact that he's become so retrenched, he's become so stubborn when it comes to trying to really get to that political settlement. And for Turkey as well, which has a very large population of displaced Syrian communities, that is something that they have been seeking to do, whether it be establish a peace corridor in northeast Syria, whether that be trying to directly engage with Assad himself. They've tried a million different ways to try and make progress on this one demand and this one expectation that they have. So I think that ultimately this is a reason why we're seeing Turkey try and change the battle lines on the ground in order to try and weaken Assad, demonstrate that they have the ability to try and influence events and influence groups that are operating in northwest Syria, and then see if that is going to change Assad's behavior at the negotiation table. I also think, and as Leila mentioned as well, there is the element of Turkey's bitter rivalry and bitter conflict with the Kurds, especially with the fact that they perceive the PKK as a terrorist organization, and also the SDF as an extension of that. And because of that, I think that we will see, as Leila mentioned, raising the ground and really trying to slash and burn SDF-controlled areas, checkpoints, communities as well. This is something that they've done on and off, whether it be a ground or air offensive. And I really do think that they're seeing this as really a breakout opportunity, first in Tel Rifat and then throughout the northeast of Syria, as a way to really try and consolidate these gains, hit the regime while they're weak, and then also potentially drive out the United States. Because there's also another element that we haven't discussed, and it's not taking place in Syria, but it's taking place in neighboring Iraq. Just a few months ago, the Biden administration announced that they are seeking to formally end the Operation Inherent Resolve mission, the coalition to defeat ISIS, and withdraw U.S. forces out of Iraq by 2026. The elephant in the room is the United States presence in Syria. We now have a very ambiguous plan for withdrawal in Iraq, but forces in Syria, particularly stationed in northeast Syria, they rely on intelligence, ISR, logistics, really the presence in Iraq in order to sustain themselves. And so really the unacknowledged reality is going to be that U.S. forces will also likely withdraw from northeast Syria, along with forces in Iraq. So potentially this would be a move from Turkey's perspective to expedite that process, to drive out U.S. forces, weaken the SDF, if not completely eliminate them, and establish that so-called peace corridor and create leverage with the Assad regime for negotiations for rapprochement.
That's a very interesting point, because obviously the roughly 900 US troops in northeast Syria, if there is a withdrawal from Iraq, simply in terms of logistics and the rest of it, that presence becomes unsustainable. In which case, and let me ask Leila if she agrees with you on this, that this whole HTS offensive could also have tacit support of Turkey, because if you can get rid of the Americans, then that large chunk in the northeast, controlled by the SDF, can basically be, that control can be diluted, and Turkey can operationally link up with its supporters in Iraq also, in the Kurdish areas where it has been operating.
I mean, yes. I mean, if you look at the Syrian map, I'm trying to figure it out over here from memory. If you look from the northeast side, you have Al-Qamishli and the Kurds and the SDF. These are the main threat to to Turkey and the Turkish troops. But if you look closely, they can actually do with Americans being there for the current period, because they want the Americans also to be their what you call police force, if they manage to pressure them enough to have an agreement with them that they can actually curb in the Kurds and secure those borders instead of having to fan out and fight everywhere. What I'm looking at the moment is the security situation in northwest Syria. That's the most important part. We have two triangles that are very important, and if at any point those triangles are well taken over by the terrorists, that means you have the two main cities, Aleppo and Hama, gone completely. And those two triangles are Ejaz, Tel Rifat, and Afrin. That's the first triangle, and that's closer to the Turkish border, and that basically threatens Aleppo from the northwestern side. And then when you look at the other triangle, that's basically Sarmada, and we're talking about Saraqib and Idlib. If you take this triangle, that's the gateway towards taking over Rif Hama and Hama. So you make your way to Khan Shaykhun and then Hama. Once you secure that area, then basically you can call that piece of land your chunk of land, and you can initiate or launch attacks against the major cities all the way down to Damascus. And let's not kid ourselves. They actually mentioned, Julani said, we're going for Damascus next. We're going after that to Egypt. He named everybody, and finally, perhaps, basically Jerusalem. That shows you their intention. If their intention is to basically support the main cause for Muslims across the world at the moment, which basically is Jerusalem, and Al-Aqsa Mosque, then they should be moving there first. They didn't move there first. But what I'm looking at the moment is SDF taking advantage of the chaos to create their own territories, and the Turks are wary about that. That's why they are talking to the Russians and the Iranians and the Americans on the side. And then you have the northwestern side, which is basically a Nusra front and some parts of ISIS also fanning out and taking over, but each their own territory. They're all collaborating at one point or another because they have a vested interest to attack Assad. But at the end of the day, this is a momentary or temporary alliance between, let's say, ISIS and Nusra because they fought in the past. And there's a temporary alliance between what you call the Turks and the Americans when it comes to SDF negotiating over there. They're not going to fight SDF directly. They're not going to fan their troops across from northwestern Syria to northeastern Syria. That leaves us with what you see towards southeastern Syria. And that's basically, we're talking about Deir ez-Zur, and then we're talking about Konoko. The Americans are there, and the Syrian government understands very well that the American presence over there is going to cause them problems, and they're going to talk to the Turks, and this is what they're doing over what we're seeing in the northeastern side. So they moved the tribes. This is basically why we saw the tribes attacking Konoko, where the American occupation forces are based. Remember, America has multiple bases across Syria, but the main two ones, one is closer to the Iraqi borders, and one is basically in eastern Syria in Konoko. And both sides are being attacked, one by the Iraqi resistance, and the other one is being attacked by the pro-Assad regime tribes. So at the end of the day, it's a what you call fight of nations using their proxies on the ground for the time being. Somebody said that Assad might resort to the Iranians and Hezbollah again. I don't believe basically Hezbollah is going to take part in these fights for the time being. There's something more brewing and more sinister happening in South Lebanon that Hezbollah is being silent about, just like we saw back in 2006, 2007, when the Israelis continued to breach Resolution 1701. They're preparing for something, I don't know what, but the whole play at the moment is just testing the waters, who can take what before Trump comes into power.
Absolutely. No, by the way, I'm really impressed. You could have been an excellent operational commander, given that you're looking at the, kind of visualizing the map and talking about the triangles and the lines of communication. So as far as I'm concerned, you're already a commissioned officer in a military. But I have to close the program also. So Caroline, we were talking about the timing and all that. So one of the things is the decapitation of Hezbollah leadership and degradation of some of the Hezbollah military capabilities. And then, of course, the ground war in South Lebanon. So that's one thing. And then, of course, a couple of rounds that have been played between Israel and Iran. And Iran is also not immediately responding because it'll go back to its strategy of the indirect approach. Russia is, of course, now busy in Ukraine. And my own sense is that they would try to take back the territory in Kursk before Trump takes office, because they would not want Kyiv to have a territory trading hand in case of any negotiation. So what we are looking at is a certain kind of vacuum in terms of the various support elements for Assad. And so my one question is, do you think that is something that's basically giving advantage to HTS? And secondly, and I know it's, one should not extrapolate into the future. It's one of those tricky things, despite knowing some trend lines. So the fact is that how do you see this situation going in the next, let's say, 4 weeks or so?
Well, certainly. And I think that Leila was absolutely correct in the sense, and I didn't mention this in my first answer, which is explain the timing of this. And she was right in the sense that right now there is a huge scramble across multiple conflicts around the world to try and recover further territory and really redraw battle lines before Trump takes office, simply because it's the Trump administration. And while we might have some forecasts and predictions, we really will not know their stance on a number of different issues. Of course, when it comes to this plan for the Middle East, we're very positive that Trump is going to try and have this grandiose deal and potentially package multiple different conflicts all in one, try and resurrect the Abraham Accords. But in terms of the very details of that, other than the fact that we know that Trump will try and offer a very clear advantage to Israel through settlements and of course, trying to consolidate more territory in both the West Bank and in Gaza. Beyond that, we don't necessarily know the details. And so because of this, I think that I agree with Leila in the sense that this is also why we're seeing so many different groups trying to take advantage of the few weeks they have left before Trump enters office. And we could have an almost overnight or sudden multi-conflict deal, so to speak. Now, when it comes to what we're going to see in the next 4-6 weeks, I think that now, at least today, we're starting to see there's a bit slowed momentum. We are starting to see, of course, the spillover into the Northeast. I think that without a doubt, we're going to see a potential Turkish air offensive, at least, if not a ground offensive into the Northeast. And potentially the regime seems to try, it is trying to consolidate its own momentum, potentially could get an additional edge with Russian strikes. Potentially they could try and solicit further support from some of their tried and true backers in the Gulf. For example, the UAE, they recently released a statement of support for the Assad regime. Potentially we could see some additional moves from, for example, Oman, the Iraqi government. But as Leila mentioned, I think that many are quite hesitant to get very directly involved in what's happening in both the Northwest and in the Northeast. Even the statement that we saw from the White House last evening had a tone of, we are monitoring the situation. And while we're not necessarily overjoyed with certain aspects, this is our stance on Assad, this is our stance on sanctions. And there was not much of any, commitment or promise to do anything or to intervene in any particular way. I think we'll see the same thing from Gulf states as well, that they're monitoring the situation. In theory, they support the particular actors, but we're not going to see any sort of direct involvement. They're going to try and ensure that this stays within Syria. That is, of course, with the exception of Turkey. Turkey, of course, I think will get directly involved. They will try and launch a direct operation in the Northeast to take advantage of the situation.
This actually redounds to the advantage of the HTS fighters. I don't know how far they can sustain it because we don't know what their logistics and the source of their logistics is. Because there is now little air presence, Russian air presence there. The Hezbollah fighters who were actually the forces on the ground that were beefing up and supporting the Assad's military forces, they're not there because their best fighters are already back in Lebanon, obviously, because that's their priority number one. And I'm not sure how Iran is going to cope with that. But it's a wicked situation because it's so complicated. And B, there's so many moving parts that obviously at this point in time, it's very difficult to project into the future. And I suspect that we'll probably have to talk about this again 4 to 6 weeks down the road. And I would love to host both of you again. But thank you so much, Carolyn Rose, Leila Hatoum. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. And I can tell you it doesn't get me any lucre, but it's going to make me very happy. And it also helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.